I have often reflected that the most extraordinary cases come to us in the most ordinary ways. It was on a bitter December morning in 1936, with London wrapped in one of those penetrating fogs that seem to seep into one's very bones, that I encountered my friend Hercule Poirot in the lobby of Brown's Hotel. He stood before a rather garish arrangement of holly and mistletoe, his head tilted at that peculiar angle which indicated deep disapproval. "Hastings, mon ami," he exclaimed upon seeing me, his green eyes lighting with genuine pleasure. "You arrive at the perfect moment to witness this assault upon the aesthetic sensibilities. Observe this barbaric display. One might suppose the English wish to bring the entire countryside indoors for Christmas." "My dear Poirot," I replied, genuinely delighted to see him after several months abroad. "Still waging war against British decorative traditions, I see." "It is a battle I fear I shall never win," he sighed, adjusting his perfectly waxed moustaches. "But come, you find me at a moment of decision. I have received this morning a most intriguing letter." He produced from his waistcoat pocket an envelope of expensive cream paper. "It is from a Miss Evelyn Blackwood of Thornfield Manor in Kent. She writes of family tensions, of a stepmother who arrived like a storm, and of fears she cannot quite name. There is something in her words, Hastings, a quality of suppressed terror, that interests me greatly." "You suspect foul play?" "I suspect nothing yet. But when a young woman writes that she fears for her father's life, and asks me to come before it is too late, then Hercule Poirot pays attention." He paused, studying my face with that penetrating gaze I knew so well. "You have the look of a man at loose ends, my friend. Perhaps the country air would restore the colour to your cheeks?" Within 2 hours we were aboard the afternoon train to Kent, the winter landscape rushing past our window like a monochrome painting. Poirot had telegraphed ahead, and we were met at the station by a motor car driven by a taciturn man who introduced himself merely as Watkins from the Manor. The House of Shadows Thornfield Manor revealed itself as we rounded a bend in the drive, a sprawling Elizabethan house of mellow stone, its many chimneys sending threads of smoke into the grey sky. But it was the orchard that commanded attention. Stretching away from the house in neat rows, the ancient apple trees stood like sentinels in the frost, their bare branches etched against the winter sky with an almost mathematical precision that would have pleased even Poirot. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said a voice behind us as we alighted from the motor. I turned to see a young woman approaching, her dark hair pinned beneath a woolen cap, her cheeks flushed with cold. She was perhaps 25, with the kind of understated beauty that speaks of good breeding and quiet strength. "I'm Eveline Blackwood. Thank you so much for coming, Monsieur Poirot. I wasn't certain you would receive my letter in time." Poirot bowed with his customary precision. "Mademoiselle, your letter suggested a matter of some urgency. I trust we are not too late." A shadow crossed her face. "I pray not, but I fear—" She broke off, glancing toward the house. "Perhaps we should go inside. The others are waiting." As we approached the front entrance, I noticed movement at one of the upper windows, a figure that withdrew quickly as soon as it was observed. Poirot, I saw, had noticed it as well, for his eyes narrowed slightly in that way that indicated he was filing away information. The discovery, we had barely crossed the threshold when a commotion erupted from the direction of the orchard. Shouts, running footsteps, and then a woman's scream that seemed to tear the winter air like a blade. "What in heaven's name—" Evelyn began, but we were already moving, following the sounds toward the orchard. There, beneath one of the oldest apple trees, a small crowd had gathered. At its center lay a figure in a dark green coat, a young woman with golden hair that caught what little light filtered through the grey sky. Even from a distance, I could see she was beyond help. "Don't touch anything," Poirot commanded sharply as we approached. The assembled group, I counted 6 people, stepped back instinctively at the authority in his voice. The dead woman was perhaps 30. with fine regular features that spoke of good breeding. She lay on her back, her arms at her sides, looking for all the world as though she had simply lain down for a rest. There was no obvious wound, no sign of violence, yet something in her attitude struck me as wrong, an indefinable quality that suggested this was no natural death. Poirot knelt beside the body, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. He lifted one of her gloved hands delicately, examining the palm, then studied the ground around her with minute attention. "Who found her?" he asked quietly. "I did," said a tall, well-dressed man with greying temples. "I'm Dr. Marcus Thorne. I was taking my morning constitutional when I saw her lying here. I checked for signs of life, but—" He shook his head. "You're a medical man?" "Yes, though I specialize in nervous disorders rather than general practice. But I know death when I see it." Poirot's eyes swept the assembled group. "And you're all guests at the manor?" "Family and guests," said Evelyn, her voice barely steady. "This is my stepmother, Mrs. Helena Blackwood." She indicated a striking woman of perhaps 35, with dark hair and pale skin, dressed in expensive furs. The woman's face was a mask of composure, but I noticed her hands trembling slightly. "My brother Roderick," Evelyn continued, nodding toward a handsome but dissolute-looking man who was smoking a cigarette with shaking fingers. "Miss Cecily Vane, our neighbour." This was a woman of vibrant beauty, with calculating eyes. "And Mr. James Pemberton, father's business partner." The last was a thin, nervous man who kept adjusting his spectacles. "And your father?" Poirot inquired. "He's in London on business," Evelyn replied. "He was to return this evening." Poirot stood brushing frost from his knees with characteristic fastidiousness. His eyes had taken on that peculiar, luminous quality I knew indicated his mind was working at full capacity. "Tell me," he said conversationally, "did anyone hear Madame Helena leave the house this morning?" The question hung in the cold air. I saw several glances exchanged, but no one spoke. "I see," said Poirot softly, "and yet here she lies, in her evening clothes beneath the morning sky. Most curious, is it not?" Dr. Thorne cleared his throat. "Perhaps she couldn't sleep. Some people find a walk in the fresh air helps with insomnia." "In evening dress, in December?" Poirot's tone was mild, but I detected the steel beneath it. "And observe, if you please, the frost upon her coat. It is not the light dusting one would expect from a brief morning walk. Non, this suggests she's been here for some time. Since last evening, perhaps?" A collective intake of breath greeted this observation. "But that's impossible," said Helena Blackwood, speaking for the first time. Her voice was low and musical, with a trace of an accent I couldn't place. "She was at dinner with us last night. We all saw her retire to her room." "Ah," said Poirot, "but did anyone see her this morning, before she was discovered here?" Silence. "Then," continued Poirot, his voice taking on that particular quality that indicated he was about to make a pronouncement, "we have a most interesting situation. A young woman dies in an orchard on a winter morning, apparently having been there all night. Yet no one noticed her absence. This suggests either a household of remarkably unobservant people, or—" He paused, his eyes moving from face to face. "Or someone wished very much for her absence to go unnoticed. The web begins to form." As we walked back toward the house, leaving the local constable to guard the scene until the police could arrive from the county town, I noticed how the group had unconsciously arranged itself. Helena Blackwood walked alone, isolated by invisible barriers. Dr. Thorne and Mr. Pemberton conversed in low voices, their heads close together. Miss Vane had attached herself to Roderick, though he seemed barely aware of her presence. Only Evelyn remained close to us, her face pale with shock. "Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "you must understand. We are not a harmonious family. There have been tensions since Helena married father 2 years ago. She's much younger than he, and beautiful, and some of us wondered—" She trailed off. Wondered what, mademoiselle? Whether her affections were entirely sincere. And the deceased, she was? Lydia Pemberton, James's daughter. She came to stay with us a week ago. She was... Evelyn hesitated. She was asking questions about Helena's background, about the marriage settlement. Father was becoming quite angry with her. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, and now she asked no more questions. As we entered the house, I caught sight of movement at an upper window, the same window where I'd noticed a figure earlier. This time I was certain. Someone was watching us, someone who preferred to remain unseen. The game, as Poirot would say, was afoot, but in this house of winter shadows and family secrets, I suspected we had only begun to glimpse the depths of the deception that lay beneath the surface. "Come, Hastings," Poirot murmured as we crossed the threshold. "Let us see what other secrets this house of winter holds, for I have the feeling that before this matter is resolved, we shall discover that the death in the orchard was merely the final act of a drama that began long before we arrived." The great hall of Thornfield Manor stretched before us, its shadows seeming to whisper of secrets yet to be revealed. And somewhere in those shadows, I was certain, lurked a killer who thought themselves very clever indeed. They had not yet met Hercule Poirot. The drawing-room at Thornfield Manor possessed that particular atmosphere of faded grandeur common to old English country houses. Heavy brocade curtains framed tall windows that looked out onto the frost-covered grounds, while oil portraits of long-dead Blackwoods gazed down from panelled walls with expressions of stern disapproval. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, yet somehow failed to dispel the chill that seemed to emanate not from the winter air, but from the assembled company itself. Poirot positioned himself with characteristic precision near the mantelpiece, where he could observe every face in the room. His green eyes, bright and alert as a bird's, moved methodically from person to person, cataloguing expressions, noting gestures, filing away the smallest details for later consideration. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his accent more pronounced than usual, "I find myself in a most delicate position. Mademoiselle Evelyn has done me the honour to consult me regarding certain family concerns, and now we are confronted with tragedy. The local police will arrive shortly, but perhaps you will permit me a few questions. It is merely to establish the simple facts, you understand." Helena Blackwood had arranged herself on the velvet sofa, with the practised grace of one accustomed to being observed. Even in her apparent distress, she maintained an almost theatrical composure, her dark hair perfectly arranged, her pale hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice carried the faintest trace of an accent that I could not quite place. "I cannot imagine what questions you might have, Monsieur Poirot. The poor girl obviously suffered some sort of attack during the night. Perhaps her heart. She was always rather delicate." "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken, madame," Poirot replied, gently. "For you see, there are certain small details that trouble the mind of Hercule Poirot. Tell me, when Mademoiselle Lydia retired last evening, what was she wearing?" The question seemed to catch the company off guard. It was Miss Cecily Vane who answered, her voice carrying a note of malicious satisfaction. She was a striking woman with auburn hair and calculating eyes, the sort who seemed to collect secrets as other women collected jewellery. She wore that dreadful mauve silk dress, the one she'd worn to dinner. I remember thinking how the colour drained all the life from her complexion. "And yet," Poirot continued smoothly, "this morning she was discovered wearing the green winter coat, so at some point she changed her clothing. This suggests a degree of planning, does it not? One does not simply wander into a December night in evening dress." Dr. Marcus Thorne cleared his throat. He was a man of perhaps 45, with greying temples and the kind of professional manner that inspired confidence in drawing rooms, but might conceal any number of secrets. Perhaps she couldn't sleep and decided to take some air. She may have changed into something more practical. "In the middle of the night? In December?" Poirot's tone remained conversational, but I detected the scepticism beneath. And you, Doctor, you discovered the body at what time? Shortly after 8 this morning. I'm an early riser by habit. I find a constitutional before breakfast clears the mind wonderfully. Roderick Blackwood, who had been standing by the window with a glass in his hand, turned suddenly. His resemblance to his sister was marked, though where Evelyn's features spoke of character and strength, his suggested weakness and dissolution. There was something feverish in his eyes, and I wondered if he had been drinking despite the early hour. How very convenient, he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. How perfectly convenient that our good doctor should happen upon her just lying there, neat as you please, with no sign of how she came to be there. Roderick! Evelyn's voice was sharp with warning, but her brother continued as if he hadn't heard. You want to know about last evening, Monsieur Poirot? Then you should know that Lydia Pemberton was asking uncomfortable questions. She told me so herself just 2 days ago. She said she'd discovered something about our dear stepmother, something that would change everything. All eyes turned to Helena Blackwood. She remained perfectly still, but I noticed her knuckles had whitened where they gripped the arm of the sofa. These are serious accusations, she said quietly. I had nothing to hide from Miss Pemberton or anyone else. Didn't you? Roderick's laugh was harsh, without humour. Then why was she so interested in your background? Why was she writing letters to Paris, making inquiries about Russian émigrés? James Pemberton, who had been sitting in silence like a man carved from stone, suddenly spoke. His voice trembled with barely suppressed emotion. My daughter believed, that is, she'd formed the opinion that Mrs. Blackwood might not be entirely truthful about her past. In what way, monsieur? Poirot's question was gentle, but his eyes had taken on that peculiar intensity I knew so well. She claimed to have found evidence that the real Helena Volkov, the woman my stepmother claims to be, died in Paris in 1925. The words fell into the room like a physical blow. Even Poirot, master of the unexpected, allowed his eyebrows to rise slightly. Helena's composure finally cracked. That is absurd. I am Helena Volkov. I fled Russia with my family during the Revolution. We settled in Paris, where I worked as a translator, until I met Edward 3 years ago. These are not secrets. They're simply painful memories I prefer not to dwell upon. And your family? Poirot inquired. All dead. The Revolution took them. Her voice was steady, but something flickered in her dark eyes. Pain, perhaps, or was it something else entirely? Yet Mademoiselle Lydia had reason to doubt this story. Before Helena could answer, the butler Watkins appeared in the doorway, his usually impassive face showing signs of distress. Begging your pardon, sir, he said, addressing Poirot, but I thought you should know. Mrs. Blackwood's maid has just informed me that the bed was not slept in last night. Not so much as a wrinkle in the coverlet. The silence that followed was profound. Outside, the wind rattled the windows with skeletal fingers, and somewhere in the house a clock chimed the half-hour with funeral solemnity. Poirot studied Helena's face with the intensity of a jeweller examining a suspect diamond. So, madame, it would appear that neither you nor Mademoiselle Lydia spent the night in your respective beds. One of you we find in the orchard, beyond all earthly concerns. The other we find here, very much alive, but with hands that tremble just the slightest bit. Helena met his gaze steadily. If you are suggesting that I murdered Lydia Pemberton, Monsieur Poirot, I can only say that you are mistaken. I suggest nothing yet, Poirot replied softly. I merely observe. It is, you might say, my profession. He moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, and gazed out at the orchard, where even now the local constable stood guard over the scene. When he turned back to face the room, his expression was grave. In this room are gathered all those who were present in the house last night. Each of you had the opportunity to move about unobserved. Each of you had some connection, however slight, to the deceased. The police will come, and they will ask about times and movements and alibis. They will speak of footprints and physical evidence. These things have their place. But for Hercule Poirot, the true interest lies in the human heart, in the passions and fears that drive people to desperate acts. He paused, allowing his gaze to rest on each face in turn. Helena's defiant beauty, Roderick's dissolute anxiety, Cecily's calculating composure, Dr. Thorne's professional calm, Pemberton's grief-stricken confusion, and finally Evelyn's frightened earnestness. Someone in this room knows why Lydia Pemberton died in the winter orchard. Someone knows what drove her from her bed on a December night to meet her fate among the apple trees. And I give you fair warning, Hercule Poirot will discover the truth. It is not merely my profession, mesdames et messieurs, it is my passion. The fire crackled in the grate, and outside the wind continued its mournful song through the bare branches of the orchard. But inside the drawing-room of Thornfield Manor, the only sound was the collective intake of breath from people who had suddenly realized they were no longer merely witnesses to tragedy. They were suspects in a murder investigation. The arrival of Inspector Marsh from the County Constabulary brought with it an air of methodical competence that complemented rather than competed with Poirot's more subtle approach. He was a solid man of middle years, with the weathered complexion of one accustomed to country duties, and the shrewd eyes of an officer who had learned not to dismiss unusual circumstances too quickly. His greeting to Poirot suggested a professional respect born of reputation rather than personal acquaintance. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, removing his hat in the front hall, "I've heard of your methods, sir. Unconventional perhaps, but effective. I hope you'll share your observations. This business has some peculiar aspects that trouble me." Poirot inclined his head graciously. "But of course, Inspector, though I fear my observations raise more questions than they answer, perhaps we might examine the scene together before the light fails entirely." The scene speaks. Standing once again beside the apple tree where Lydia Pemberton's body had lain, Poirot pointed out details that had escaped the initial examination. "Observe, Inspector, the position of the body. She lay upon her back, arms at her sides, as peaceful as one taking an afternoon rest. There was no sign of struggle, no disarrangement of clothing. Yet consider this." He knelt and indicated the ground. The earth beneath where she lay was quite dry, while all around the frost lay thick upon the grass. Inspector Marsh frowned. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning that the body was placed here after the frost had formed in the early hours, which suggests she did not walk to this spot of her own volition. She was carried here, already dead or dying, and arranged with considerable care." Poirot rose, brushing imaginary dust from his knees. "This was not a crime of passion, Inspector. This was a crime of calculation. The implications settled over both men like the winter mist that was beginning to gather among the bare branches." "Murder, then," Marsh said quietly. "Premeditated murder." "So it would appear. But the question remains, why arrange the body so conspicuously? Why not hide it where it might never be found?" "No, Inspector. Someone wished for this discovery. The question is, why?" The house reveals its secrets. Returning to the manor, Poirot requested a tour of the household arrangements. Evelyn, pale but composed, led us through the main corridors, explaining the layout with the precision of one who had grown up within these walls. The family bedrooms were arranged along the front corridor of the first floor. Helena's room commanded the best view, overlooking the drive and the formal gardens beyond. Her door stood slightly ajar, revealing a chamber decorated in rich blues and golds, with an unmistakably feminine touch that spoke of recent occupancy. 2 doors down lay the guest room that had been assigned to Lydia Pemberton. "And your brother?" Poirot inquired as we paused at the head of the main staircase. "Roderick's room is at the back, above the library," Evelyn replied. "He prefers the quiet. The other guests, Dr. Thorne and Mr. Pemberton, are in the east wing, and Miss Vane has the rose room overlooking the side garden." Poirot nodded, filing away the information with visible satisfaction. "And the servants?" "Mostly in the attic rooms. Watkins has quarters near the service stairs. He's been with the family for 20 years and takes his responsibilities seriously. Lydia's room. The chamber that had housed Lydia Pemberton was neat to the point of austerity. Her suitcase lay open on the luggage stand, revealing carefully folded garments of good quality but conservative cut. On the writing desk stood an inkstand, several sheets of hotel notepaper bearing a Paris address, and a small leather-bound notebook secured with an elastic band. Poirot's sharp eyes moved methodically around the room, taking in the wardrobe, the fireplace, the window that looked out over the front drive. He examined the window latch carefully, then peered down at the gravel below. The window was not used as an exit, he murmured to himself. Too high, too visible from the main hall. He turned to Evelyn. "Tell me, mademoiselle, did you hear anything unusual during the night?" "Nothing," she replied. "I slept heavily. There had been brandy after dinner, and I am not accustomed to strong spirits. I had developed quite a headache and retired early." "Ah, yes, the brandy," Poirot said, his tones suggesting this detail held particular significance. "Perhaps you would tell us about the evening's events?" "The previous evening, reconstructed. We returned to the morning room, where the remains of a hastily abandoned breakfast still littered the long table. Poirot seated himself with his characteristic precision, motioning for Evelyn to take the chair opposite. I positioned myself slightly to one side, content to observe and record. "Last night," Evelyn began slowly, "we were 7 at dinner. Father was still in London, so it was myself, Helena, Roderick, Dr. Thorne, Mr. Pemberton and his daughter, and Miss Vane. The atmosphere was strained. Lydia had been asking questions about Helena's background, about her life in Paris, about dates and people she claimed to know. And Mrs. Blackwood's response? Polite at first, then increasingly irritated. After dinner in the drawing room, Lydia persisted with her inquiries. There was a scene of sorts, though nothing openly scandalous. Helena maintained her composure, but I could see she was becoming quite angry. It was then that the brandy appeared? Yes. Roderick suggested it might settle everyone's nerves. He poured rather generously. I think he was nervous himself, talking too much, trying to lighten the mood. Helena refused hers entirely. Lydia accepted a small measure but barely touched it. Mr. Pemberton insisted it would help his daughter's agitation, though she seemed perfectly composed to me. Poirot's fingers drummed silently against the table. "And you, mademoiselle?" "I finished mine rather quickly, I'm afraid. My head was pounding, and I excused myself shortly after. I left them still in the drawing-room, still engaged in that peculiar sort of argument where the real subject is never mentioned directly. The web of motives. Inspector Marsh had been taking notes throughout this recitation. Now he looked up with the expression of a man beginning to see patterns emerge from chaos. So we have a young woman making uncomfortable inquiries about the stepmother's past, a family gathering with tensions running high, and a victim who retires to bed but somehow ends up dead in the orchard. The stepmother whose bed was not slept in becomes the obvious suspect." "Perhaps too obvious," Poirot murmured. "In my experience, Inspector, the guilty party rarely leaves such convenient clues. Consider, if Madame Helena wished to silence Mademoiselle Lydia, would she do so in a manner that pointed so directly to herself? Would she leave her bed conspicuously unoccupied? No, this has the feeling of a trap, carefully baited." "Then who?" Marsh asked. "The brother with his gambling debts? The neighbour with her calculating eyes? The business partner whose daughter threatened to expose family secrets?" "All possibilities," Poirot agreed, "but we must also consider that murder is always a deeply personal crime. Someone in this house felt threatened enough by Lydia Pemberton's inquiries to silence her permanently. The question is not merely who had opportunity, but who had the most to lose." The master's return. Our discussion was interrupted by the appearance of Watkins in the doorway. His usually impassive features showed signs of strain as he delivered his message. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen, but there's been a telephone call from London. Mr. Edward Blackwood has heard of the tragedy and is returning immediately. He should arrive within the hour." Inspector Marsh rose from his chair. Excellent. I want to question him thoroughly about his wife's background and the family dynamics. As will I, Poirot said quietly. For you see, Inspector, I suspect that the key to this mystery lies not in what happened last night, but in events that occurred much earlier. The death in the orchard was merely the final act of a drama that has been playing out for some time. He moved to the window, gazing out at the gathering dusk. The winter landscape seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next revelation. Someone in this house believed they had committed the perfect crime, he continued. They arranged the scene to direct suspicion elsewhere, counting on our assumptions and prejudices, but they underestimated one crucial factor, the psychology of guilt. For in trying too hard to appear innocent, they may have revealed themselves as surely as if they had confessed. The sound of a motor car on the gravel drive announced Edward Blackwood's arrival. Through the window, we could see the headlights cutting through the growing darkness as they swept up the circular drive. Come, Inspector, Poirot said, straightening his waistcoat. The master of the house returns to find his domain touched by tragedy. His reactions will tell us much about the true nature of this family's secrets, for I have learned that in cases such as this, the most revealing moments often come not from what people say, but from what they cannot help but reveal when they believe themselves unobserved. As we prepared to greet Edward Blackwood, I could not shake the feeling that we were about to witness the next crucial scene in a carefully orchestrated drama, one where the final curtain had not yet fallen, and the true villain had yet to take their bow. The afternoon light filtering through the tall windows of Thornfield Manor's library cast long shadows across the Persian carpet, creating an atmosphere of scholarly contemplation that seemed at odds with the grim business at hand. Poirot had arranged himself behind the mahogany desk with characteristic precision, the surface before him bearing the accumulated evidence of his investigation, statements, timetables, and most significantly, the small leather notebook recovered from Lydia Pemberton's room. Inspector Marsh had departed an hour earlier with the preliminary toxicology report, leaving Poirot to conduct what he termed his psychological examination of the household. The method was deliberate, individual interviews rather than group confrontation, allowing him to observe each suspect's reactions without the distraction of others' presence. The revelation of method. The laboratory has confirmed our suspicions, Poirot announced to the first gathering of the afternoon, his voice carrying that particular authority that commanded attention. The assembled company, Dr. Thorne, Roderick and Miss Vane, shifted uneasily in their chairs. Mademoiselle Lydia was poisoned with veronal, administered in a quantity quite incompatible with life. This was not accident, not suicide, but deliberate murder. Dr. Thorne's professional composure wavered slightly. Veronal is a common sedative. Many households keep it for cases of insomnia or nervous tension. Precisely, Doctor. And you, as a medical man, would have ready access to such substances. Your professional bag, examined with your permission this morning, contained an open bottle of veronal tablets, most convenient for someone wishing to administer a fatal dose. I sometimes take a mild dose myself for sleep, Thorne protested. There's nothing suspicious in that. Nothing at all, Poirot agreed smoothly. Yet you failed to mention this personal use when we first discussed the household's access to sedatives. A small omission, perhaps, but in matters of murder, the smallest details often prove most illuminating. The individual confrontations. After dismissing the others, Poirot summoned Roderick for private conversation. The young man entered with studied casualness, but his hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. Your debts are considerable, Monsieur Roderick, Poirot observed without preamble. £5,000 to certain London gentlemen known for their impatience. Your stepmother controls the family finances, and she has shown little sympathy for your predicament. Helena wouldn't give me a shilling if I were dying, Roderick replied bitterly. But if she were removed from the equation, or better yet, discredited as an impostor, that would restore your access to the family fortune, would it not? Poirot's eyes glittered with interest. You were seen leaving the house at 2 in the morning, without your coat, which Watkins found still hanging in the cloakroom this morning. A curious detail for a man claiming to have taken a walk in the December cold. Roderick's cigarette burned forgotten between his fingers. I couldn't sleep. I went to the conservatory, then wandered about the house. I wasn't keeping track of time. Miss Cecily Vane proved more challenging to unsettle. She entered with perfect composure, her silk dress rustling as she arranged herself in the chair with practiced grace. You spend considerable time at Thornfield for a mere neighbour, Poirot observed. One might think you had particular interests here beyond friendship with Mademoiselle Evelyn. I've known the family for years, she replied smoothly. Edward and I are old friends. Close enough that you argued with the first Mrs. Blackwood shortly before her fatal accident 3 years ago. A fall down the stairs, ruled accidental despite the curious timing. Poirot's voice remained conversational, but his eyes had taken on that peculiar intensity I knew so well. And now another obstacle to your ambitions has been removed. Tell me, what were you doing outside Lydia's room at midnight? The old floorboards are treacherous. They announce every footstep to those with ears to hear. For the first time Cecily's composure cracked. I was not in that corridor. Ah, but Watkins has excellent hearing for a man of his age, and he was quite specific about the sound of feminine footsteps pausing outside the guest room door. The heart of the mystery. Helena Blackwood entered last, moving with the dignity of a woman facing execution. She wore black, whether in mourning or by design, and her pale hands remained steady despite the ordeal she'd endured. Madame, Poirot said gently, you are afraid. Not of murder charges, I think, but of exposure. Lydia Pemberton had discovered something about your identity, had she not? Helena's carefully maintained composure began to crumble. She thought she knew things. She was guessing, making wild accusations. She had evidence, Poirot continued, lifting the leather notebook from his desk. This belonged to her. It contains names, dates, places. Paris, 1925. References to a cabaret singer named Elena Volkov who died of tuberculosis. And curious gaps, pages, that have been torn out with surgical precision. He paused, studying her face. Someone wished to erase certain information, but they forgot that Hercule Poirot has an excellent memory for details observed before evidence disappears. I didn't kill her, Helena whispered. I went to her room to talk, to explain, to beg her silence, but she wasn't there. The bed was empty. I waited in the conservatory all night, terrified of what morning might bring. And yet, you were seen in the orchard, madame, the frost on your coat when we discovered the body. It spoke of recent exposure to the December air. I went out later when she didn't return. I found her there, already dead. I panicked and ran back to the house. I thought they would blame me, the foreign wife with secrets to hide. The psychological trap. Springs. Poirot rose from his chair, moving to the window where the winter orchard lay visible in the gathering dusk. When he spoke again, his voice carried that particular quality that indicated he was approaching the climax of his investigation. Someone in this house believed they had arranged the perfect crime. They counted on our assumptions, our prejudices. The mysterious foreign wife with a questionable past becomes the obvious suspect. But they made a crucial error. They underestimated the psychology of guilt. He turned back to face the room, though Helena was his only audience now. The killer among you is beginning to betray themselves, not through physical evidence, which can be manufactured or concealed, but through the reactions of the human heart under pressure. Fear makes people careless, and carelessness reveals truth. Tonight I say only this. Lydia Pemberton died because she reached too close to someone's secret. I intend to reach closer still. And I promise you the next time I speak so frankly, it will not be to suggest possibilities, but to name the murderer. As Helena departed, her footsteps echoing in the corridor beyond, Poirot remained by the window, his reflection ghost-like in the darkening glass. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour with solemn finality. The psychological game had begun in earnest, and the killer, whoever they might be, was beginning to feel the inexorable pressure of Hercule Poirot's methodical investigation. The trap was set baited with half-truths and careful observations. Very soon, someone would make the fatal mistake that would expose them to the relentless logic of the little Belgian detective. It was only a matter of time, patience, and the careful observation of human nature under the microscope of suspicion. In the growing darkness outside, the winter orchard stood silent and accusatory, its bare branches reaching toward the sky like the fingers of the dead. But inside Thornfield Manor, the living wrestled with secrets that grew heavier with each passing hour, knowing that somewhere among them walked a killer who believed themselves cleverer than Hercule Poirot. They would soon discover their error. The dinner bell at Thornfield Manor rang with hollow finality, summoning a household that seemed to shrink from the very act of gathering. The dining room, with its gleaming mahogany and flickering candles, had become a stage where each player performed their role with desperate precision. Edward Blackwood presided at the head of the table with the grim dignity of a man watching his world collapse, while Helena sat pale and composed, her dark eyes reflecting the candlelight like still water. Poirot had positioned himself with characteristic calculation, able to observe every face while appearing to concentrate on his meal. I noticed his almost imperceptible cataloguing of gestures, Roderick's trembling fingers as he reached for his wine-glass, Miss Vane's too bright smile, Dr. Thorne's professional composure that seemed slightly forced, James Pemberton's hollow-eyed grief. The conversation limped along in fits and starts, punctuated by the clink of silver against china and the soft footsteps of Watkins as he served each course with his usual efficiency. Yet something in the butler's manner had changed since morning, a nervous quality, a tendency to avoid direct eye contact that had not been present before. It was during the fish course that Poirot made one of his seemingly casual observations that I had learned to recognize as deliberate provocations. "It is remarkable," he said, delicately removing a bone from his soul, "how the dead continue to influence the living. Poor Mademoiselle Lydia, she sought truth, and truth, as we know, is often a dangerous commodity." The effect was instantaneous. Edward's fork clattered against his plate. Helena's hand froze halfway to her wine-glass. Roderick muttered something inaudible and reached for the decanter with shaking fingers. "You speak as if she was some sort of investigative journalist," Miss Vane said with forced lightness. "She was simply a curious young woman, perhaps too curious for her own good." "Precisely, mademoiselle," Poirot replied smoothly, "and curiosity, when it uncovers inconvenient truths, often proves fatal. Tell me, did any of you know that Mademoiselle Lydia had been corresponding with someone in London? Someone who specialized in verifying identities and backgrounds? This revelation struck the table like a physical blow. I saw Dr. Thorne's medical bag, which he kept beside his chair, shift slightly as his knee knocked against it. The movement was barely perceptible, but Poirot's sharp eyes missed nothing. "How do you know this?" Edward demanded, his voice hoarse. "The torn pages from her notebook were not destroyed, monsieur, merely hidden. And hidden things, they have a way of revealing themselves to those who know where to look." Poirot's eyes moved deliberately around the table. "Someone among you knew of these inquiries. Someone feared what they might reveal." The butler's flight. The tension might have continued to build through the remainder of the meal, but it was shattered by an unexpected interruption. Watkins, who had been absent for an unusually long period, failed to appear for the removal of the fish course. When Edward rang the bell with visible irritation, it was answered not by the butler but by young Mary, the housemaid, her face flushed with distress. "Begging your pardon, sir," she stammered, "but Watkins has gone. Left not 20 minutes past he did, with his travelling bag and a letter for the police. Said he couldn't stay another moment in this house." The silence that followed was profound. Poirot rose from his chair with sudden energy, his usual deliberate movements replaced by urgent purpose. "The letter, where is it?" "On his desk in the pantry, sir. He said Inspector Marsh was to have it, but he couldn't wait." We abandoned the meal entirely, the entire company following Poirot to the butler's quarters. The letter lay precisely where Mary had indicated, written in Watkins' careful copperplate hand. I have served this family faithfully for 20 years, but I cannot be party to murder. I saw who entered Miss Lydia's room on the night she died. I saw who left it again near midnight, carrying something wrapped in a towel. I thought to keep silent for the family's honour, but my conscience will not permit it. The person responsible knows I saw them. I fear for my safety if I remain. I will contact the police from London and tell them everything. W. Watkins. Poirot's realization. As Inspector Marsh was summoned by telephone, Poirot stood in the butler's small room, his green eyes bright with that peculiar luminosity that indicated his mind working at full capacity. He examined the desk, the wardrobe, the small window that looked out onto the service yard. Hastings, he said quietly, I have been approaching this case from entirely the wrong direction. I looked at the obvious suspect, the foreign wife with secrets to hide, and assumed the motive lay there. But what if the secret was different entirely? What if someone used the convenient suspicion surrounding Madame Helena as a screen for their own desperate actions? He turned to face the assembled company, who had crowded into the small room with morbid fascination. Watkins served this family for 20 years. He knew its rhythms, its secrets, its hidden shames, and he saw something on the night of the murder that terrified him enough to abandon everything he had known. But who? Evelyn whispered. Who could have frightened him so badly? Poirot's eyes moved slowly from face to face, and I saw something shift in his expression, a hardening, a certainty that had been building throughout the evening. Someone who had access to medical knowledge and supplies, he said softly. Someone who understood the effects of veronal and how to administer it. Someone who could move through this house without attracting attention. Someone who had their own reasons for wanting Lydia Pemberton silenced. Reasons that had nothing to do with Madame Helena's past. The implications of his words settled over the room like a shroud. Somewhere in London, a frightened butler was preparing to reveal a murderer's identity. But here in Thornfield Manor, that same murderer was growing desperate, knowing that their carefully constructed deception was beginning to crumble. The game was entering its final phase, and the stakes had never been higher. In the gathering darkness outside, winter tightened its grip on the Kent countryside, but inside the manor house, the chill came from a different source entirely. The cold calculation of a killer who had believed themselves far too clever to be caught. The evening had settled over Thornfield Manor like a shroud, bringing with it an atmosphere of barely controlled panic. Inspector Marsh's telephone calls to the railway station and local constabulary had yielded nothing. Watkins had simply vanished into the December night, leaving behind only his cryptic letter and a household that seemed to grow more unstable with each passing hour. Poirot had withdrawn to the library once more, where I found him standing before the tall windows, his reflection ghost-like in the darkened glass. His usual meticulous appearance showed signs of strain, a slight dishevelment that spoke of a mind working at full capacity. Hastings, he said without turning, I have been considering the psychology of flight. When a man abandons 20 years of faithful service, what drives him? Fear, certainly. But fear of what precisely? Of being accused, or of something far more immediate and dangerous? Before I could respond, the sound of running footsteps echoed from the main corridor, followed by Mary's voice calling urgently for Inspector Marsh. We hurried to the front hall, where we found the housemaid in a state of considerable distress. "It's Watkins, sir," she gasped to the inspector. Young Tom from the village found him not an hour past, in the old potting shed at the far end of the kitchen garden. He's dead, sir. The final witness. The potting shed stood isolated among the vegetable beds, a stone structure that had served the manor's gardens for generations. Inside, by the light of police lanterns, we found Watkins sprawled among the garden tools, a heavy spade lying nearby, its blade stained with something dark. But it was not the manner of his death that captured Poirot's attention. It was what clutched in the butler's stiffening fingers. A fragment of fabric, Poirot murmured, carefully extracting a small piece of dark wool from the dead man's grasp. And observe, Inspector, the pattern of the weave. This is not from a servant's clothing, nor from any garment I've seen the ladies wear. This is from a gentleman's coat, expensive, well tailored. Inspector Marsh examined the fabric with his magnifying glass. Could have come from any of the men in the house? Perhaps, but consider the circumstances. Watkins was struck down as he fled, struck by someone who followed him here, someone desperate to prevent his testimony, someone who knew exactly what he had witnessed. Poirot's eyes moved methodically around the small shed, taking in every detail. And someone who made a crucial error in their desperation. Near the doorway, half hidden beneath a pile of burlap sacks, Poirot discovered a small brown bottle. Unlike the veronal in Dr. Thorne's medical bag, this one bore no label, but the residue of white crystals at the bottom told its own story. The murder weapon, he said softly, discarded here in panic after Watkins' death. But why here, Hastings? Why not dispose of it more thoroughly? The medical evidence. Returning to the house, Poirot requested another examination of Dr. Thorne's medical bag. This time his scrutiny was even more intense, his fingers moving delicately among the instruments and medications. Observe, he said, lifting a small syringe. Recently sterilized, boiled in fact, with meticulous care. And here he indicated an empty vial labeled adrenaline, a stimulant used in cases of cardiac emergency. Yet no one in this house has suffered heart failure requiring such intervention. Dr. Thorne, who had been summoned to witness this examination, shifted, uncomfortably. I maintained my supplies in proper order. The syringe was cleaned as a matter of routine. Routine? Poirot's eyebrows rose. Yet you have not used it recently for any patient. So why the urgent sterilization? Unless... He paused, his green eyes taking on that peculiar luminosity. Unless it was used for a purpose that required absolute cleanliness afterward, a purpose that would leave traces requiring elimination. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Inspector Marsh leaned forward. Are you suggesting the syringe was used in the murder? I am suggesting that veronal alone did not kill Mademoiselle Lydia. Veronal induces sleep, then coma, then death, but slowly. Yet she was found positioned carefully in the orchard, moved there hours after death. How does one transport an unconscious person without waking the household? How does one ensure they never regain consciousness to cry out? The brandy revelation. There is another element that has troubled me, Poirot continued, moving to the sideboard where the brandy decanter still stood from the previous evening. The brandy served after dinner, poured by Monsieur Roderick, who was most insistent that everyone partake. Yet observe the levels in these glasses, still unwashed from that night. He indicated the crystal glasses arranged on a silver tray. Mademoiselle Evelyn's glass, completely empty. She drank deeply and retired with a severe headache, sleeping so soundly she heard nothing all night. Madame Helena's glass, untouched. Mademoiselle Lydia's, barely tasted, the others varying amounts. What are you suggesting? Inspector Marsh asked. That someone wished to ensure Mademoiselle Evelyn would not be awake to hear what transpired in the night. Her room is adjacent to the guest corridor. She might have heard sounds of disturbance, cries for help, footsteps on the stairs, so her brandy was doctored to guarantee her unconsciousness. The identity investigation. Our discussion was interrupted by the telephone. The caller identified himself as Mr. Carstairs, the London inquiry agent whom Lydia Pemberton had engaged. His report, delivered in crisp, professional tones, confirmed what many had suspected. The real Helena Volkov died in a Paris charity hospital in 1925, Poirot relayed after ending the call. The woman now calling herself by that name assumed the identity sometime thereafter. But here is what interests me most. Mademoiselle Lydia had requested information not only about the false Helena, but about several other individuals, including a certain Dr. Marcus Thorne, regarding a patient death in 1933 that was ruled natural but raised questions among the family. The pieces were falling into place with mathematical precision, yet Poirot's expression remained troubled. The pattern emerges, but it is not yet complete. There is some crucial element that continues to elude me. The hidden clue revealed. It was then, as we prepared to leave the library, that Poirot made his crucial observation. He had been examining the carpet near the door, noting the various footprints and scuff marks left by the day's investigations. Suddenly, he knelt with sharp attention. "Voila," he whispered, "the thing that has been troubling the little grey cells." There, impressed faintly in the carpet pile, was a distinctive pattern, a small circular indentation, repeated at regular intervals, as though someone had walked this path many times, leaning heavily on a walking stick with a rubber tip. "But none of the family uses such a stick," I observed. "Precisely, Hastings. Yet someone has walked this route repeatedly, from the main hall, through the library, to the service corridor beyond. Someone who needed support but wished to remain unobserved. Someone who knew the house well enough to use the servants' passages." He rose, his eyes bright with understanding. "The killer moves among us, Hastings, but not as we have assumed. The motive is not what we thought. The method is more sophisticated than we imagined. And the identity—" He paused, studying the carpet pattern with intense concentration. "The identity of our murderer will surprise us all. The trap is set." As we returned to the main hall, Poirot's demeanour had changed completely. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence I had learned to recognize as the prelude to revelation. "Inspector," he said to Marsh, "tomorrow morning I will gather all the suspects in the drawing-room. Tonight, let them believe their secrets are safe. Let the killer think that Watkins' death has secured their position. For you see, they have made one fatal error. They have underestimated Hercule Poirot." He moved to the window, gazing out at the winter orchard where this tragedy had begun. "The little grey cells have done their work. The pattern is clear, the motive understood, the method revealed. What remains is only the final act, the moment when all masks are removed and truth stands naked before us." The house around us seemed to hold its breath, as though the very walls were waiting for the morning's revelations. Somewhere within these corridors walked a killer who believed themselves safe, protected by the convenient suspicions surrounding others. They had not yet learned that in the game of detection, Hercule Poirot always held the winning hand. Tomorrow would bring justice to Thornfield Manor. Tonight brought only the terrible waiting, and the knowledge that among the sleeping household, one person would not rest easy, for they alone knew that their time was running out. The hidden clue had been found. The trap was set. The endgame was about to begin. The morning light filtering through the tall windows of Thornfield Manor's drawing-room possessed an almost judicial quality, illuminating faces that bore the weight of sleepless hours and guilty secrets. The frost-covered orchard, visible beyond the glass, served as a stark reminder of the tragedy that had brought them to this moment. Poirot positioned himself before the fireplace with theatrical precision, his small figure somehow commanding the attention of every person in the room. Inspector Marsh stood by the door, a silent representative of justice, while I took my customary place with notebook in hand. The assembled company arranged themselves with the unconscious choreography of people who had learned to avoid each other's eyes. Edward Blackwood, haggard and aged beyond his years. Helena, pale as winter moonlight. Roderick, trembling with barely controlled anxiety. Miss Vane, maintaining her composure through sheer force of will. Dr. Thorne, professionally calm, but with shadows beneath his eyes. James Pemberton, hollow with grief, and Evelyn moving like a ghost through rooms that had become alien to her. The misdirection addressed. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his accent more pronounced than usual, a sure sign that his mind was working at full capacity. "We gather here to discuss not one murder, but two: the death of Mademoiselle Lydia Pemberton and the brutal silencing of poor Watkins. Both died because they possessed dangerous knowledge. Both were eliminated by someone in this room who believed themselves far too clever for Hercule Poirot. He paused, allowing his penetrating gaze to rest on each face in turn. When I first arrived at Thornfield Manor, I made precisely the error that our killer intended. I looked at Madame Helena with her mysterious past and convenient secrets, and I thought, voila, here is my obvious suspect. A foreign woman with a false identity, threatened by exposure. How perfectly simple. Helena's hands tightened in her lap, but she maintained her dignity with visible effort. But the little grey cells, they were troubled, Poirot continued, beginning to pace with measured steps, for you see the psychology was entirely wrong. If Madame Helena wished to silence Mademoiselle Lydia, would she do so in a manner that pointed so directly to herself? Would she leave her bed so conspicuously unoccupied? Would she arrange the body where it must inevitably be discovered? No, mes amis. Someone wished very much to direct suspicion toward Madame Helena. Someone counted on our prejudices and assumptions. The medical evidence unveiled. Let us examine the method, Poirot said, his voice taking on that particular quality that indicated he was approaching the heart of his revelation. Veronal was administered to Mademoiselle Lydia. This the laboratory has confirmed. But Veronal alone does not explain the sequence of events. She retired to her room apparently well, yet somehow was transported to the orchard and arranged there with meticulous care. He turned to face Dr. Thorne directly. A medical man would understand the progression of veronal poisoning, the initial drowsiness, the growing confusion, the eventual loss of consciousness. But a medical man would also understand that veronal requires time to achieve its fatal effect, time during which a victim might cry out, might struggle, might alert the household to their distress. Dr. Thorne's professional composure showed the first signs of strain. What exactly are you suggesting, Monsieur Poirot? I suggest nothing, Doctor. I state facts. The hypodermic syringe in your medical bag, so carefully sterilized after its recent use. The empty vial that once contained adrenaline, a substance which in concentrated doses can stop a heart as surely as any poison. And most significantly, your insistence on being present in this house on the night of the murder. The motive exposed. Inspector Marsh leaned forward with visible interest. But what possible motive could Dr. Thorne have for killing Lydia Pemberton? Ah, Inspector, for that we must delve into the past, Poirot replied, producing Lydia's leather notebook. Mademoiselle Lydia was investigating not merely Madame Helena's identity, but several other matters of equal sensitivity, including the suspicious death of a wealthy patient under Dr. Thorne's care in 1933, a Mrs. Ashford who died suddenly and conveniently, left a substantial bequest to her attending physician. The colour drained from Dr. Thorne's face. That death was thoroughly investigated and ruled natural causes. By a coroner who happened to be your personal friend, Poirot observed with devastating calm. But Mademoiselle Lydia had obtained the original medical records. She had consulted with independent physicians. She had discovered that Mrs. Ashford's symptoms were entirely consistent with an injection of concentrated adrenaline, the very substance now missing from your medical supplies. The room erupted in shocked exclamations, but Poirot continued relentlessly. You see, Doctor, Mademoiselle Lydia made the fatal error of confronting you privately with her evidence. She came to you seeking confirmation, believing a man of science would be an ally in her pursuit of truth. Instead, she found her executioner. The method revealed. The sequence of events was carefully planned, Poirot continued, his voice cutting through the chaos. You met with Lydia in one of the small sitting rooms near the guest corridor. You offered her something to calm her nerves, perhaps a mild sedative to help her sleep after such disturbing revelations. She trusted you completely. Why would she not trust a respected physician? Dr. Thorne had begun to sway slightly, gripping the back of his chair for support. The Veronal was administered by injection, not orally as we first assumed. A quick insertion of the needle disguised perhaps as a vitamin injection or mild stimulant. As she grew drowsy, you supported her, helped her to her room, tucked her into bed like the caring doctor you pretended to be, but you did not leave her there to die peacefully. Poirot's eyes glittered with the intensity of complete understanding. No, doctor. You waited. You waited until the household was deep in sleep, then returned to her room. You found her unconscious but still breathing. It was then you administered the adrenaline, not to save her, but to briefly stimulate her heart, to wake her just enough to walk, supported by you, through the servants' passages to the conservatory, and finally to the orchard. There, as the stimulant wore off, and the Veronal reasserted its deadly grip, you arranged her carefully beneath the apple tree. You positioned her as though she had simply lain down to rest, removing any sign of struggle or violence. Then you returned to the house, confident that morning would bring the discovery of an apparent natural death. The witness eliminated, but Watkins saw you, Poirot continued inexorably. Faithful Watkins, who knew every sound in this house, who noticed when footsteps passed through corridors where they should not be. He saw you carrying something wrapped in a towel, the unconscious Lydia, through the service passages. His loyalty to the family kept him silent initially, but his conscience would not let him rest. James Pemberton looked up with anguished eyes. And so you killed him too. When Watkins finally decided to flee and tell the authorities what he had witnessed, Dr. Thorne followed him to the potting shed. There was a struggle, hence the fabric torn from the doctor's overcoat and clutched in poor Watkins' dying hand. The butler was struck down with a garden spade, his testimony silenced forever. The psychological trap springs. But you made one crucial error, Doctor, Poirot said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. In your desperation to eliminate Watkins, you injured your leg during the struggle. The next morning, when we walked to examine the scene, you leaned more heavily on your walking stick than before. Those distinctive circular impressions in the library carpet, the marks in the garden path, they told their own story of a man favouring an injured limb. Dr. Thorne's legs seemed to give way beneath him, and he collapsed into his chair, all pretense of professional dignity abandoned. Moreover, Poirot continued, your psychological reaction betrayed you. When we discovered Lydia's body, you were quick to pronounce natural causes, despite the unusual circumstances. You discouraged further investigation, suggested heart failure or some similar malady. Yet when the poison was discovered, you showed no surprise, because you already knew what the laboratory would find. The confession. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire and Dr. Thorne's laboured breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. She wouldn't listen. To reason, he whispered, his carefully maintained facade crumbling completely. I explained that Mrs. Ashford was dying anyway, that I merely hastened the inevitable. The money allowed me to continue my research to help other patients. But Lydia saw only murder. She threatened to expose everything, to destroy my life's work. And so you destroyed her, Poirot said quietly. 2 lives lost to protect your reputation and your freedom. Inspector Marsh moved forward with handcuffs, his voice formal as he recited the charges. As they led Dr. Thorne from the room, he paused at the threshold, looking back at the assembled company with something approaching regret. I am a healer, he said, his voice breaking. I dedicated my life to saving people, but once you cross that line, once you take a life, it becomes easier the second time. Justice and reflection. The door closed behind the doctor and his escort, leaving the drawing room in stunned silence. Through the windows, the winter sun continued to shine on the orchard, where 2 innocent people had met their fate, indifferent to the human drama that had played out beneath its branches. Poirot moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression grave. The truth, he murmured, is always simple in the end. It is only people who complicate it with their fears, their greed, their desperate attempts to hide from consequences. He turned back to face the survivors, a family shattered by tragedy but finally free from the web of lies that had ensnared them. Helena wept quietly. No longer the mysterious foreign threat, but simply a frightened woman who had assumed a dead cousin's identity to escape poverty. Edward held his wife's hand, seeing her clearly for the first time. The others sat in various states of shock and relief, processing the revelation that the killer had walked among them, wearing the mask of a trusted family friend. Justice has come to Thornfield Manor, Poirot said softly. But as always, it comes at a price that can never be fully paid. 2 lives lost, a family scarred, trust shattered. This is the true cost of murder, mes amis. Not merely the death of the victim, but the destruction of everything the killer touches. The winter orchard stood silent beyond the windows, its bare branches reaching toward the sky like supplicating fingers. But inside Thornfield Manor, the living could finally begin the long process of healing, knowing that the shadow of murder had been lifted from their midst, and that Hercule Poirot had once again proven that no crime, however cleverly conceived, could long escape the relentless pursuit of truth. The drawing room of Thornfield Manor bore little resemblance to the tense courtroom it had become the previous day. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits above the assembled company. Yea, the dramatic revelations had passed, leaving behind the quieter but no less important work of healing and resolution. Poirot positioned himself near the fireplace, his demeanour notably gentler than during the investigation. The theatrical intensity had given way to something approaching pastoral concern, as though the little Belgian detective understood that his role had shifted from prosecutor to counsellor. The official business is concluded, he began, his accent softer than usual. But there remain matters of the heart that require attention. Dr. Thorne will face justice for his crimes, but you must face the future with honesty as your foundation. The question of identity. Helena Blackwood sat beside her husband, their hands clasped with a unity that had been absent throughout the ordeal. Her pale face showed the strain of exposure, yet also a curious relief, as though the burden of deception had finally been lifted. The authorities have informed me, Poirot continued, addressing her directly, that while your assumption of your cousin's identity constitutes fraud, the circumstances, a refugee fleeing poverty, seeking only survival, will be viewed with compassion. There may be legal proceedings, but Inspector Marsh believes a sympathetic magistrate will impose minimal penalties, perhaps only restitution of any benefits received under false pretenses. Edward's grip on his wife's hand tightened. Whatever the cost, we'll face it together. I married the woman you are, not the name on your papers. Précisément, Poirot said with visible satisfaction. Love, when it is genuine, sees beyond the surface to the essential truth of a person. This is a lesson many could learn from Monsieur Blackwood's example. Individual reckonings. Roderick, who had spent the morning in his father's study discussing his future, looked younger somehow, as though confession had restored something vital to his character. I've asked father for a position in the firm, he announced quietly. A real position, with real responsibilities. No more gambling, no more living on expectations. Poirot nodded approvingly. The debts that drove you to desperation, they were symptoms of a deeper malady. When a man has no purpose beyond his own pleasure, he becomes prey to every temptation. Work, honest work, is often the cure for such ailments. James Pemberton, aged by grief but no longer consumed by uncertainty, spoke with quiet dignity. My daughter would have wanted her death to mean something. Knowing that Dr. Thorne can harm no one else, it doesn't bring her back, but it gives her death purpose. Mademoiselle Lydia possessed a passion for truth that was both her greatest strength and her fatal weakness, Poirot replied gently. She lacked only the patience to gather her evidence safely. But her courage exposed a killer who might otherwise have continued his deadly work for years. The household's future. Evelyn, who had remained largely silent throughout these exchanges, finally spoke. What happens to Thornfield now? How do we live in a place where such terrible things occurred? Houses do not retain guilt, mademoiselle, Poirot answered. They retain only what we choose to remember. This manor has known happiness as well as tragedy. It can know happiness again if you choose to build it upon truth rather than comfortable deceptions. The practical arrangements had already begun. A new butler had been engaged from London, recommended by an agency that understood discretion. The guest rooms would be redecorated, their associations with tragedy softened by fresh paint and new furnishings. Life, as Poirot observed, has a remarkable capacity for renewal when given the opportunity. Philosophical reflections. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Poirot moved to the window overlooking the orchard. The bare branches no longer seemed accusatory, but merely dormant, waiting for spring's inevitable return. This case has reminded me, he said thoughtfully, that murder is never truly about the victim. It is about the killer's inability to accept consequences, their willingness to destroy others rather than face their own failures. Dr. Thorne killed not from passion or desperation, but from the cold calculation that his comfort was worth more than human life. He turned back to the room, his green eyes bright with understanding. But observe how truth, once revealed, has the power to heal as well as wound. Madame Helena's deception, exposed, has brought her closer to her husband. Monsieur Roderick's weakness, acknowledged, has become the foundation for strength. Even poor Watkins, in death, achieved the moral courage that eluded him in life. Departure and renewal. As Hastings and I prepared to leave Thornfield Manor, the winter sun was setting behind the orchard, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The thaw that had begun that morning continued, water dripping steadily from the eaves like nature's own absolution. Another case closed, I observed as our motor car appeared on the drive. Closed but never finished, Poirot replied, adjusting his overcoat with characteristic precision. The consequences of these events will ripple through many lives for years to come, but they will be honest consequences now, faced with courage rather than hidden behind lies. The family gathered on the front steps to see us off, Edward and Helena standing together, Roderick beside his sister, even James Pemberton managing a grateful smile. They looked, I thought, like people who had survived a terrible storm and found themselves still standing, battered perhaps but fundamentally whole. The spring will come, Poirot murmured as we settled into our seats. It always does, mon ami, and when it comes to Thornfield Manor, it will find a family that has learned the difference between secrets that protect and secrets that destroy. As we drove away through the gathering dusk, I reflected that this case, like all of Poirot's greatest triumphs, had been about more than solving a murder. It had been about understanding the human heart in all its complexity, its capacity for both terrible evil and remarkable redemption. The girl in the winter orchard would not be forgotten, but neither would she be the final word in Thornfield Manor's story. Truth, as Poirot had demonstrated once again, possessed a power that even death could not diminish. The little grey cells had done their work, justice had been served, and somewhere in the gathering darkness the promise of spring whispered through the bare branches of the orchard, carrying with it the eternal hope of renewal.